Huckabee is a certified master clockmaker, certified by the American Watchmakers Institute. Tape 20 continues the subject matter of pivot work, and that pivot work, which began on tape 19, come to a close as we were about to place a bushing in this hole in the plate. The hole that we have in the plate is 3 millimeters in diameter. Was created by this reamer. This is a D-section reamer. This 3 millimeters at its largest point, and the plate was set in a drill press and carried from pivot hole size up to the diameter of the reamer, like this. When that was completed, we used the little 3-cornered scraper as a deburring tool to deburr the entryway of the hole, and we're ready to install the bushing in the plate at this point. I make up bushings. This is a string of a dozen or two of the bushings. When I make a setup and make these, I can produce these at the rate of one about every 1.5 or 2 minutes, and find it very economical to make those with the tools that I have. If you're using commercial bushing reamers, there are a variety of bushing tools and reamers and types that are available, but if you're using those, use the bushings that are appropriate to the reamers. And if you're placing these in and by hand method, then you can do much as will be demonstrated here. Larger bushings, I insert them with a little arbor press. Some sizes bushings, I use a punch and a drill press with the drill press not running, and use that as the press to insert the bushings in the plate. So we're prepared, ready to set this in position. The bushing that we have point this out here. This is a little tapered rod. I usually hold these on a brooch. I don't know why I picked this one up at the moment. This is slipped on there to hold this. That places a handle on it so that it's easy to handle, and we'll press that right in here. This bushing has about 3/1000 of an inch interference fit from the size that I machine these. We will drive it in place right here, and then we will ream it to size. Let me pause for the tools that we need to press that into place. Tools needed: bench block, stump from a giant staking set, clockmaker staking set, and we need this stump because this is above the plate, and we need the stump to pass through the back side like this to support this bridge as we drive that bushing in place. Let's slip the bushing off of the holder and start it into its hole, just simply to keep from dropping it. We set this stump didn't fit. I had it bottom up there, is what the trouble was. We sit this down here, and this is a point that I need some help. I really need a third hand. So we'll pause and I'll get some help for that. Returning, the situation at hand reminds me of a story that was in the Children's Reader when I was in about the second grade, I suppose. The story went something like this: that there was a peasant family of old time who had a son that grew up and went away to seek his fortune, and he became very wealthy. And he returned many years later, and he says, "Mama, I've made my fortune. I'll give you three wishes. I'll grant 3 wishes if anything can be bought with money." And she says, "All right, I have to be very careful." And she says, "First wish, I think I want a new pipe." He said, "All right, I'll buy you the most expensive pipe in the world." And she says, "And I want all the tobacco that I can smoke for the remainder of my life." And he says, "All right, I'll buy you a tobacco farm and all the tobacco you want for the remainder of your life. What is your 3rd wish?" And after considerable thought, she says, "I believe I'll just take a little more tobacco." Now that's the way I am in this shop about the bench block situation. Bench block here, so on. While the camera was off, I counted up here. I have 14 bench blocks sitting over here, various sizes. What I was after was some combination that I could sit right here that would third hand this while I drive this in place. So much for the childhood story. And the bench blocks we'll move aside. And we have this bushing driven in place. Now let's inspect this thing very carefully. We're flush with the surface. I cut the oil sink on this to some degree in the lathe when that was made. We're flush on the back side. We're driven into the hole, and the thing that we need is to set the pivot size to fit the escape wheel. Let's look at the pivot size. We have considerable distance to go, and we'll get a broach and see what we can do with that. We send this. We determined a little earlier that the next size broach is appropriate for the pivot, but we have to pretty much go up the taper of that one before this one will enter the hole. So let's see what we have now. No, not yet. And we go a little further. As I'm broaching this hole, I'm watching this plate. Let's see if I can get into the camera like this. I'm looking for this angle to equal this angle. That's the uprightness of the broach as I'm broaching. I'm also looking at it in this view, the same thing. It looks like I need to correct a little here in the uprightness of that. And look again. I am just about to enter that hole. That's much too tight there. We try a little more, and we look at this, round and round and round. Being this is the escape wheel, we'll fit this one up pretty close, a little closer. This is about a 5-degree clearance that we have there. We discussed on a previous tape what 5 degrees means is that we can tip the shaft about 5 degrees in every direction. So we're approximately on size there. We will now go into this with the round smoothing broach, like that, and from the other side. We would like to break the edge, break the sharp edge on the inside of that hole ever so slightly. The easiest way to do that is with a pivot hole swaging punch, like that. And let's turn over and do the same thing on this side. I suppose I'm going to have to get my stack of bench blocks again, and we'll form that oil sink just a little bit deeper. All right. Touch this again with the broach. Now let's look at the uprightness of the pivot. No, that's not quite enough. When I swaged that, I must have closed the hole ever so slightly. A little bit more. Okay. Touch with the smoothing broach. Both sides. And see how we look. Okay. Next step. Very important step. We need to do this to each of the wheels. Is to try this single wheel, one at a time. See that we can tip this both ways from upright on both axes. And assemble the wheel and the plate. Alright, here's the thing that we're interested in. Give this wheel a spin. How long will it run? Turn it face down, inspect it again. Turn it face up, we do it again, all sides. And we find that wheel is running very, very smoothly, very free. Let's see if we can see about how long this runs with a good spin here. Let's try the situation with the adjacent wheel. Remember now, when we place a bushing in a plate, we place the rear bushing in, we place the front bushing in, we may have created a problem of depthing to the adjacent wheel. Adjacent wheel. See what we have here. Let's roll these wheels very gently and see that we are indeed free. And we are. Let's inspect the backlash. We'll inspect the backlash all the way around the pinion, and then we'll try this at about 4 or 5 places around the wheel. And that is very good. Let's give this a spin and see what we have. All right. Let's inspect the job that we've done. How does it look? Slip the escape wheel out, and let's look into the back side. I don't know if we'll be able to see into that pivot. We're looking right through this. We're looking through this hole right here into the back side. we're flush with the surface. We have a slight chamfer on the entry of that hole. On this side, we have the classic oil sink. We have the chamfered ring around where the bushing is tapered on the edge. And let's compare the appearance of the bushing that we placed in the plate well, I thought we'd be able to see this a little better in the magnifying glass. It looks so nice through the glass to my own eye here, but I can't see it very well on the camera. But the description, it looks very, very similar to this. Now, these are not bushings. This is a finish around the pivots that is original to the movement. If we look at this and we look at this, we find that this is ever so slightly larger in diameter than there. Otherwise, you would not even detect that it is a bushing that has been replaced. So that's how easy it is to get a bushing in a movement. Now, being that we were working this train and did some pivot hole work down here, let's assemble the area of the train that we've been working on. That is this wheel and this wheel. It has to go in next, and this one. We have to go in at the same time. They're so close to the pivots, and the escape wheel. Get the escape wheel in from up here on top. All right. We have this is the complement of wheels that we have worked on the pivots. Let's look at the end play, end play, the end play, and the end play. Let's feel this side shake and look at the pivots while we're doing that. And we're okay there. Now let's look into the back side here. We have a new bushing here. These holes have been reduced in size. If we look at them, it's I seriously doubt that even the most careful workman could discern that we have reduced the diameter of some of those holes. Their diameters have been reduced only like 2 to 5 thousandths of an inch. We turn this train, it is extremely free. The train, of course, is dry. There's no lubricant on it, and just the slightest force here will send it running. And let's see how that we go there. Let's look at it. All pivots lying on this side. All pivots lying on this side. That is, sides being front and back. So we have the all of the wheels and pivots in order. Now, as we think on this bushing situation. And early up on the discussion of the previous tape, and we did some pivot hole closing here. I made the statement that there is a place in the industry for closing pivot holes. There is a place in the industry for bushings, and each used with discretion doesn't really degrade the movement, and it restores its operating quality. I would categorically say that if a hole has to be pulled in more than about 5/1000ths of an inch on the diameter, and I'm speaking of holes that are about the size of these, then it is a mistake to close the hole. And we know the botchery of hole closing that we see in many repair jobs. As discussed on the previous tape, we find that this group of holes here is closed, 4 of them, and there was 3 holes closed and 1 bushed here, 3 holes closed, no, I'm sorry, 2 holes closed and 1 bushed here. And as we saw in the close-up analysis of this, it's not even discernible that that has gone on. Now, I'm not debating the pros and cons of which is best and what should be done, because each workman must look at the movement that he has at hand, look at the circumstances he has, and see what is appropriate to it. But the thing I am saying, to categorically condemn hole closing is, I think, really a mistake. So we have the movement in what appears to be good order, ready to be assembled from the time side. Now we need to set the wheels in and do the same situation on the strike side and take a look at that. So we'll pause on the camera and I'll pull these out and we'll prepare the other side. Continuing, we have 4 wheels in the strike train. Now, we mentioned a little earlier that all 4 of these wheels had some work done on the pivots, had the pivots polished and the holes snugged up a bit. And this is assembled completely dry. And we give this a little pull and we find everything spins very, very free. You'll notice here that I have not assembled the fly and just running the pinion, and the reason for that is to take off the retarding braking action of the fan fly while we were checking this. So we find this train is very, very free, very good order, and we will assemble the movement and get it going and take a look again. Now, what I want to do is to assemble the movement, and when we get it together, I want to get the camera down in a very close-up view, and we'll inspect every one of these pivot holes that we have done work on. So from here, I'll shut down the camera and I will assemble the movement in its entirety. Being that the teaching is pivot work and the associated items, I don't think that I will go through purely the assembly of the movement on the camera. So we'll be back with you later with the movement assembled. Returning to the pivot work on this American clock movement, let's give the work that we've done today a critique and draw some conclusions about the results that we have. I have a serious problem in being able to look into this situation with the camera because of the light reflections, and I found that through a dark yellow filter and reducing the light almost to minimum exposure, that we can look into this without a great number of shadows. Let's look at this pivot right here and discuss what happened in that situation. This pivot had ringing on the pivot. It is rings, score marks around the pivot, annular rings around the pivot. We placed that in the polishing fixture in a watchmaker's lathe, and we polished the pivot, and then found that after we had used a round smoothing broach to clean out the hole, that we were just a mite too loose. Now, I did not feel that it was appropriate to place a bushing in this for about 5/1000ths of an inch slack, so this hole was closed by the techniques that was demonstrated on the earlier part of the film. This looks like a watermark or a tarnish mark on the movement plate here, and a moment ago I got a pencil mark pointing this, but this pivot is close fit, well finished. That hole has been closed by the hole closing technique that we demonstrated, and I feel confident that in a critique of this job that the viewer would call this well done. Now let's look at the fly pivot, which is right here. This is the pinion end of the fly pivot, and we'll see if we can touch the focus to get that in order. This pivot hole likewise was closed, and the pivot was first polished, and then the hole in the plate was closed. Let's move over and look at another. This pivot here, that hole was closed. Let's work on the focus a little. All right. If we look into this, we find that this one had to be closed a rather substantial distance, and in the closing process it appears that there is a very small oil sink around that hole, and that is indeed true. This movement did not have oil sinks on the rear plate of the movement, so this one wound up in the closing process that we picked up just ever so slight ring around this, symmetrical ring around it in that operation. That pivot too was polished and was cut down rather substantial amount, and then the plate worked over there. Now let me find this one in the camera and touch the focus on that. I'm having a little problem stopping in the point of best focus, and I'll try a little flashlight out here in the distance someplace. Let's see which one I'm looking for, that one. See if we can, this is a tiny little pin light, and we'll see if we can play the light around this a little bit to change the appearance of the shadow. There is a small bit of tarnish about right there, or a little ding That was on the plate originally, and that was not a result of the closing process. We see the fit of that pivot in the hole. This is assembled now and in operating condition, and we'll go through a couple of strikes. That's striking 2 o'clock, then 3 o'clock, etc. Let's look in the time side and see what we have there. I have to get my finger on this pivot to find it when I look in the monitor. Let's look at this one right here. All right, and we'll touch the focus there. All right, that pivot was cut down somewhat, and you recall that this is the rear of the escape wheel pivot. This is the pinion end of the escape wheel arbor, and this is the one that had the hole worn almost 2 pivot diameters large. This is the one that we could tip the arbor from up to down as we face the front of the clock. We could tip the front end of that arbor about 30 degrees each side of the perpendicular to the rear plate. Let me play the light there just a bit and see if we can follow around the reflections in that. This is the pivot. This is the bushing that we placed in there, and this is the one that we were concerned about getting the pivot centered as to its original location. Let me point here. This pivot at this location was also closed. We'll look at that, or the hole was closed. We'll look at that a little later. But I want to call your attention to this little marker right there, and a little marker. We're out of the camera. I have to find this next marker. That marker is right here in the plate. That marker, and let's look on this one down here at this pivot. I'll try the focus on that one. Okay, that marker and this marker. Those 2 markers are the position of the prick marks that we used with Mr. Coleman's preacher tool to locate and to assess finding our center. That marker was placed there. That is not a closing marker. And that was the, you recall, the little instrument that we used to assess whether or not we could locate that pivot correctly, and we did, and that's the origin of those 2. This pivot hole was closed. Let's look at it closer. And we'll play the light on that a little, and it winds up with what appears as a very small oil sink around that pivot. This one was closed, and find that in the camera and get in focus. We have a shadow on that. We'll try a little light from the little flashlight, and we don't seem to be able to do much good there. But this one, for all practical purposes, it is not discernible that was done. We also closed this one. Let's get that in the camera and in focus. And we'll try playing a little light around that to help us look at the situation with reflections. This is the second wheel of the time train, the third wheel, the fourth wheel, and the escape wheel. All right, let's turn over and look on the opposite side and see what we have. We want to look at this one right here. This is the escape wheel pivot. I believe that's about as well as I can do on that. You recall that we cut this bridge out and made the bushing, and the bushing is placed in that pivot, or in that pivot hole. Let's play there while we take a little more careful look at that. Now, let's look at right here. Well, I need to get a little different angle here. Well, we're not doing too good on this one. Maybe I can hand hold this thing in a little better position, possibly right there. All right, this hole. This hole here looks just like the bushing that we put into the escape wheel. If we take a little mental image of that, and we turn over and look at the image of this, we find that we're looking at, in essence, the same thing there. Now, this is the way that this pivot looked originally. You recall when we discussed this that we said on the front plate that we had some pivot hole finishing that in about 4 or 5 positions, 5 positions I believe, 3 on the strike side, and well, it was 6 positions, 3 on the time side, and that we closed that hole. It yet has the appearance of the original pivot hole, and we recognize that it also looks like the bushing that we placed in that wheel. Now let's drop down and look at one down here. And we'll see if we can get that a little better in focus. All right, there is a tiny prick mark right there. That prick mark was there before the movement was torn down. It's very close into the pivot hole itself, there was no evidence that that tiny little prick was ever there to close the pivot hole. The thing that I suspect that this could have been, many of these movements were built with a basic plate and with a variety of pendulum lengths. The movement was altered for different beat rates and different pendulum lengths by two methods. One is changing the ratio in the train to some extent. Another is changing the number of teeth in the escape wheel. Another is changing the count of the one or more of the pinions in the train. And you'll find that many of these old movements have other prick marks, and particularly near the pivot area. And when the movement was when the plate was manufactured, when it was ready for assembly, it was drilled in the appropriate prick mark. And we find that different train counts, different pinions, will have these relocated ever so slightly. For instance, right here is a hole. In all probability, in some train count, that hole was used for a pivot, and it has no function in this plate. I presume that's what the situation was here. Because our closing operation, that mark was there, it is yet there, and there is no evidence otherwise of what we have done. That is not a part of the action here. Let's look into the strike train. See if we can find this one. This hole was closed rather substantially. This hole was closed rather substantially, as was this one, and this one was closed ever so slightly. I don't have the camera on the place I'm pointing. This is the fly pivot right here. We closed this one, but there is no remaining evidence of these activities. So the thing that I want to show, that there is a place for a good bushing job. There is a place for a good hole closing job. Hole closing would not suffice in the case of our escape wheel. We just could not have made the grade here with a hole closing job. We could not have made the grade on the opposite end of the shaft with a hole closing job. On the other hand, there was really no point in placing a bushing, let's say, for instance, right here, because the degree that was closed was only a few thousandths of an inch, probably 3/4 or possibly 5 thousandths of an inch. Since we were looking earlier on the camera, several hours has lapsed. We had several interruptions here on the ranch, and I've gotten back and assembled this, set it into operation, and it has run for some good little time. Now let's, talking about this running, let's look at another item here. Well, we're just in too close to see well what I'm looking for. The suspension spring here, when I set this up and set it into operation, I found the pendulum wobbled rather badly. And classically, we hear the comment, you've got a kink in the suspension spring, you've got crooked rod, crutch is not in order, and the rod is not in a plumb line, these types of things. And all of these have a degree of merit. But the real reason that the pendulum was wobbling in this, and the reason I replaced this suspension spring, is because that the strength of the spring was inappropriate for the pendulum. I stopped the pendulum and wound it up in a rotary motion by, maybe 10-15 degrees, but 15 degrees possibly, released it and let it oscillate as a 400-day clock pendulum would oscillate. I found that the oscillatory rate was almost exactly 2 reversals in the period of time that it would make a swing in one direction. Now that said that its rotary oscillatory rate was at the second harmonic of its basic vibratory rate. That says that it would be virtually impossible to ever suppress that operation. And the solution to that is to replace the suspension spring with one that is softer being either thinner or narrower, so that the oscillatory rate becomes slower, or increase it with a spring that is shorter, wider, or thicker, or a combination thereof, to give it a faster oscillatory rate so that they're not directly harmonically related. And that we did in the time that we were off the camera. This is a commercial pendulum rod that I buy by the dozen here, and it was too long. The spring was too long, because you see the crutch is very near the lower end of the spring. I don't know whether that was original to this movement or not. I noticed that the crutch is spliced up here in this area, and it may be that the crutch was originally longer than that. But anyway, we disposed of the secondary oscillation on the pendulum while we were at that. Now, let me pause a minute and get this movement around in another vantage point, and look at some other factors. Let's talk about test run. I will need to test run this movement, and let's see why and how long that a test run should be conducted to be satisfactory. All right, look at this mainspring. Look at this mainspring. That spring is essentially down. Here a little later I will wind it and count the turns required for the wind. You recall a little earlier, and I have on a card here somewhere, let me find this. And I think I misstated that spring, the number of turns of winding required on that spring earlier in the tape. The great wheel makes one revolution in 24 hours, 24.2, I'm sorry, it requires 24.23 hours, and that's about 24 hours and 13 minutes or something like that, 14 minutes, to run the movement one day. And I stated that it would take just over 8 turns of the mainspring to power the movement for 8 days. So that statement was really wrong. It takes a little less than 8 turns to power the mainspring for 8 days. When I get this a little further along, I'll pull the spring up to full wind, and I'll see how many turns that I have at this point. The reason I'm interested in this, when I hung the movement here and started it running, the pendulum immediately picked up to a very healthy swing, And in that healthy swing, it had substantial recoil and the recoil escapement that shows that everything was in good mechanical health. Now, the pivots have all been polished, the holes have been burnished, and we operate very successfully with the mainspring energy essentially depleted. So from that reason, I won't have to test run this thing a week to see if it will run for a week. Pure and simple. I have no fear whatsoever of latent frictions or whatnot in binding the pivots, because the pivots have all been placed in good order and the escapement adjustment in order. So the sole purpose of a test run on this will be to assure that the rate is compatible with the capability of the movement, because that I have replaced that pendulum rod suspension spring. Well, I measured that spring rather accurately against the old one. That is, the length of it and the suspension point to the hook where the pendulum is supported. But remember this, that a suspension spring that has greater beam strength will hasten the movement rate, all other things being equal. A spring that is softer will permit the rate to retard a little. So the mere fact that it's another spring means that I will be required to make a test run. But we see that situation there. I exercise the striking mechanism with the striker spring down a little farther than this one. As a matter of fact, it was down to where the spring was touching this stud, this guard stud that's through the movement here. The reason that I wound it full, I wanted to see if it was possible to slip the fly arbor inside the fly with a full wind. Now let's speak to the fly. Let me turn that hammer out here so we can stand this up there. Let's get up here and look in this. I need to do a little better than that. Let's try again. There is considerable wear in the fly pinion right here. Considerable wear in these pinion wires. When I disassembled this movement, this fly was so tight, it was so tight on this shaft that I had difficulty getting it off. Now, that is the thing that tears up the fly pinion. In the years past, I have occasionally found a fly on a clock that has been soldered in place. Let me tell you, that will tear that pinion up, tear that pivot up, tear the pivot hole up faster than you can ever imagine. Because when this fly is racing, and we're just about at the time to strike here. Let's see if I can find a hand and move this on a little. When this fly is racing, not racing, but normal operation like this, and we stop the motion, we stop that motion instantaneously. The motion is stopped instantaneously. And when that happens, the stored energy that's in this movement is dissipated against a positive brake, and something must give momentarily. And it's the wear tear on the pinion, it's the wear tear on the wheel. Of course, the wheel doesn't show it up like the pinion does, for the simple reason you've got more teeth. Of course, you stop in the same general position, same general few teeth, even so. Now, the tension on this fly, pull the fly off, and by cupping this slightly we can increase or decrease the tension on the arbor. The tension should be the very minimum that we can place on this that is consistent with the arbor carrying the fly without it spinning and racing. Now let's look at something here. Let's call this dot here top side, and let's see if we can get one on this right here that we can see. I believe we can find that one. Now let's set this to striking and see what happens. That's striking one of the higher hour numbers there, and we stopped, and let's see what happened. Here's the marker that we placed on that, but where is the marker on this? It didn't disappear. That fly slipped at least 1/2 turn when we stopped. And that permits the fly to overrun the pinion without a tear-up situation when we stop. Now let's bring it back. Here's the side that's marked. There's our marker. Let's go through another strike and see what we have when we wind up here. Okay. Here's our marker. We're stopping the pinion about the same place every time. And I don't see the marker there. Let's back out and look. It's on the other side. So you see that fly slips each time we stop. It's important that it slips each time we stop. One more time. Here are the two markers. While the strike is running, I want to call your attention to another situation here. Well, this is stopped. Let's find the place. There's the marker there. Here's the marker there. So the point is made. The fly does slip each time we stop, and the friction should be the very minimum that can be used to for this not to slip in normal operation and let the striker race. That was an item that we did some adjustment on there. Now, the next thing I want to call your attention to is this pivot, this pinion. Can you see the end play running in that pinion? Now, the thing that makes that happen just might be a multitude of things beyond number. We usually imagine that the wheel down here wobbling is contributory to that. And let's ask the question, is that desirable or undesirable? You remember this movement had ringing on the pivots. It is scored rings around the pivots all over it. A wheel that floats, pivots that float, as this one did in its operation, one that floats will not ring, because whatever is causing the ringing is spread over a greater area, and it's healthy for that to happen. I've never really known the fine part of fine clocks, how important it is for these wheels to run absolutely true and flat. And of course we strive for that. We strive for that operation. But I seriously doubt that ever so slight wobble is very detrimental to the movement, because desirably we'd like for all of these to float. This down here is pretty tight, but we would like for them to wander. We'd like for each one of these to wander a little bit from time to time, because that float, I am firmly convinced, is advantageous to the longevity of the repair, or the longevity of the time between repairs. If we look at this, I can only get to one end. We can see the end play in these items here. See the end play here. When I made the measurements for this movement, I concluded that the target value of the distance between the plates was 1 3/8 inches. The length of the 4 pillars was not equal, but or the 5 pillars, but the average of the length of those 5 pillars was about 1 inch 370 thousandths, and that is just 5 thousandths of an inch under 1 3/8. I measured the length shoulder to shoulder of all of the wheels in an attempt to shoulder to shoulder of the pivots of the arbors of all the wheels. I made an attempt to discern what the target value of end play in these was in the original manufacture, and the conclusion was that the end play was the target value was about 20 thousandths of an inch, and this was mostly discerned from the shoulder to shoulder distance on these arbors that support some of the striker control wires and whatnot that in all probability have never been refinished, repolished, reworked, and would have maintained their original shoulder to shoulder length. So what we find is that the end shake in this movement originally was very, very great. When I say very, very great, I'm sure it's nominal for the particular class of movement and the workmanship that was used. We compared to, let's say, a fine French clock or some English fusee unit or a fine jewelry store regulator, something of that type, this end play would seem excessive. But remember that we said that this movement is not rigid. You see, I can twist this right in my hands. So the end play situation that we looked at, it's pretty conclusive that about 20 thousandths of an inch was the original target value. Another item that looked into here is this bridge. See if we can get this little bridge that carries the pin that the verge operates on. Was pretty badly beat up. It has been abused very badly in time past. As a matter of fact, it pretty much classes with most of the pivot hole closing that I've seen come over the bench here. And for some reason, that bridge essentially touches a pivot that's underneath it. It's on the hour hand reduction gears. And that had been pried on with a screwdriver or held with a rough plier or something till the end of that pivot was pretty badly beat up there. And I'm at a loss to understand why or how that could have happened. I also noticed some ding marks right along here, as if this had been held in a plier, that this escape wheel bridge has been held in a plier. And the conclusion is that that's probably not the original verge, and that for some reason there was depthing problems in this. But I asked this clock, what in the world happened to you? And it said nothing. So that's some of the mystery that that we see in clockmaking and clockwork. Another interesting item, this feeler right here. I get where we can get in the camera. This feeler here had a deep slot worn in it. That slot was as deep as one of these teeth, was as deep as one of these train wheel teeth. And I'm sorry that when I tore it down, I didn't observe whether or not that was the area of the feeler that was in use, or whether this had been moved over. But it was quite a mystery as to how that notch got in there. I presume that it had been dragging on these teeth due to, this is the count wheel teeth that I'm pointing right here. I presume that that was worn in there from that. But it's difficult to understand how that soft brass could wear a deep notch in this feeler. I filed off the worn part and reformed the shape up here and adjusted that to get that back into order. Now, let me pause for a moment here. And pick up an item, and let's discuss another problem in clockmaking. Well, I paused to pick up another item, and as I do on approximately every one of these random clock talk tapes, I painted myself in a corner again. What I was looking for is a great wheel. I thought I had in a scrap box here a great wheel from one of these clock movements of this very type, and I found I couldn't locate it. What I want to speak to, and I'll show you on this movement, I can't show this too well, but I want you to look at these teeth right here. Notice that this side of this tooth is washed out. The other side has the original form. Look at the left side, the left being that direction, of each of these teeth, and you'll see where they've been riding the lantern pinion that this wheel shows considerable wear. I saw in, I believe it was the most recent horological journal. Today is the 23rd day of September 1988, so it would have probably have been either the August or the September issue. In the tips of things to do to solve your problems that they suggested, someone suggested reversing this wheel. That is, take the wheel and turn it upside down in the clock movement. I suppose that every generation has to invent the wheel, but I've been reversing wheels occasionally for the last 50 years. And that wasn't original to me. The idea was passed on from some older workmen at the time. But if we examine this wheel, there is a heavy burr on both sides of the wheel. And that material has done what is commonly called in the mechanical engineering world as the characteristic is called cold flow. That is, the pressure is so great that the material yields as if we were squeezing a piece of bubble gum or a piece of rubber or something of that nature. And whatever it is deformed in that cold flow, or in the flow under pressure, the material is not gone. If this were literally worn, the burrs wouldn't be here. The material would be abraded away and it would have fallen off in the trash or gone away in lubricant or whatever. But it appears that essentially all of the material is yet there in the form of a burr out on the side of this wheel, on the sides of the teeth. Being I could not find the wheel that I was going to do some demonstrating on, I said, well, if teeth look like this, and let's call that just a bad one, these are washed out in one side like this. And the material that's there is raised up as a burr divided between the two sides. Over many, many years, I've tried to decide what to do about that situation. What do you do about it? And as a young man working in the ITR division of IBM, that's the International Time Recorder division of IBM that no longer exists, I was in the latter days, I was one of the latter day workmen of the era of what was called stem winder attendance recorders. Stem winder meant that it was wound with a key. The attendance recorder had usually a 72-beat pendulum type clock. That section of the case was about 3 feet long, and about the bottom foot and a half of the case had the attendance recorder, where the workman placed his time card in a slot and pushed a lever, and a bell rang, and it recorded the time in or out, as the case might be, on the card. It was placed in a rack. That entire mechanism was driven off of a pair of mainsprings. Those mainsprings were real doozies. They were 1 inch wide, and they were about 45 thousandths of an inch thick. Now, if you increase the width of a mainspring, such as this, if we increase the width of the mainspring, if we double the width, we double the strength. Pure and simple. If the spring gets twice as wide, it's twice as strong. But if you're not aware of this, and this is a mind-boggling situation, if you double the thickness of it, you do not double the strength, because the beam strength of that spring is proportional to the cube to the third power of the change in thickness. That says if you double the thickness of that spring, it becomes 8 times as strong. 8 times as strong. That's why that a very small change in mainspring thickness makes a very substantial change in its strength. Now imagine going from about 16 thousandths in this mainspring to about 45 thousandths. That's about 3 times. So if you'd say 3 times 3 times 3, that becomes 27 times as strong as this spring. On that basis, it was a third wider, so we add a third to that. And that clock had a pair of those springs in it. And it was wound with a key that had a cross arm on it that hung out about 5 inches in on each side. That key was about 10 inches long. The cross arm on the key was about 10 inches long and was about the size of your little finger. And you usually wound it with both hands. Now the great wheels in that movement were 1/8 of an inch thick. And if we look at the thickness of the great wheel in this movement, it's 50 thousandths of an inch thick. We were 2.5 times as thick as this wheel. We had a mainspring that was 30 or more times as strong. And in that wheel, it was 1/8 of an inch thick. We had the same problem that is exhibited right here. And every once in a while, one of those things would get away. And let me tell you, it would play havoc when it happened. When we'd have those movements down for some reason other than that, we would place these wheels on a bench block. As a matter of fact, that bench block right there, that bench block was issued to me as a tool in IBM in 1947. We'd place that wheel on the bench block, the flat of the wheel on it, and we would take the little hammer, the little 2-ounce Stanley hammer that you see me using on these tapes. It was issued at the same time. And we'd go around that wheel, just tap, 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 round and round and round, like this. Tap, 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 tap. And we would drive those burrs back down flush. Now let's ask, does that fix the problem? No, it doesn't. It really doesn't. You got the same pressure, you have the same material, you've taken the burrs, you've driven them back inward. But we imagined that that was the thing to do for this reason and this reason only. It postponed the inevitable. It just moved the inevitable further down in the life of the movement. We also rationalized that in doing that we work hardened that brass, and it would take possibly a little longer time for it to occur again. But you see, those movements all got scrapped out by the end of the 1950s, and I never knew whether we were just making noise or whether we were really doing some good. All right, let's think about this. When I had this movement down here this morning, while we were off the camera, I took the little hammer and I went around this wheel on the time side and did the very thing that I discussed here in the IBM experience. Now let's see if we can see this a little better. Maybe we can get a shadow or something under this wheel and look at these teeth. But if we look at the teeth, somewhere along here, the condition that I was showing earlier over on the strike side, we don't see that. I did this to one wheel and one wheel only. Now, I don't know whether, in my experience in this life, I'll ever find out the answer, whether that does any good or not. When I remove this movement, from the case a day or so ago, I found behind it a little piece of paper folded, about 2 inches by 3 inches, sticking behind this movement. In the case, it was badly oil soaked, and it had a note typewritten on it. And what I found, that note said that that clock belonged to George P. Overby of Jackson, Mississippi, and that I repaired this movement, this very movement, in July of 1961. Well, the clock belongs to somebody else now, but if it ever crosses, I'm going to leave the note in it, and if it ever crosses my bench again, it will be interesting to look at these wheels and see what the situation is like. We may ask, how long will it take for this to show up? I imagine it will show a little bit of that burring in a day or so. But the total extent of it, I don't know. So as we think on that situation, store this in your mind as purely academics and unproven philosophy. So I don't know whether that does any good or not. I do know that reversing the wheel should give it as much life, approximately as much life as it originally had, or I believe that it would. In reversing the wheel, there's not a particular problem in reversing the wheel. It's just work. In this one, there is a little tab lanced out right in here. That little tab that's lanced out there is to hook the click pawl spring in. You've got a little problem in hooking the click pawl up when you reverse the wheel. This lanced section has to go away because it would interfere with the spring. And it's been my experience, generally, if you're careful, you can drive that back through the hole and out the other side without breaking it. If it looks like that it might break, if you turn a little propane torch on it for a few moments and just heat this area of the wheel, it will soften it, and you can do that. The problem of getting the ratchet wheel off, the arbors off, disassembling this, that's not a particular problem if you have large bench block, large holes, deep, large punches with deep holes in them. That's not a particular problem to get off and back on. If I have a problem for any reason, I just categorically do this. If for any reason I have to pull the ratchet or some of this off of a clock, I usually reverse the wheel if it shows any evidence of wear. The click rivet presents somewhat a problem right in here. If right in that area, if you're careful in cutting the riveted shoulder and taking the rivet out, you won't distort the wheel at all. If you have a problem with the hole, you can always relocate it in another spoke. And I usually machine up a new rivet to go in the wheel. I know you can buy rivets and grab bags, but those usually work out about like balance staff watches that come in a grab bag. They almost fit every watch, but do not really fit any watch. And if you're handy with a lathe, you can turn up a rivet that's a perfect fit in just 5 minutes or less. So that's from the discussion on that. Now, if we look around at other circumstances on this movement, let's ask, what is the value of it? Well, I prepared a clock recently for a lady who is, I suppose she's about 55-ish years old, and she told me that that clock was a wedding gift to her mother and father, and it had been in the family that period of time. They had been married several years when this lady was born. She's the oldest child of the family. But let me tell you, that old clock was priceless. You would probably get away easier with running your car into her car and destroying it than you would if you run your car over her mama's clock. So don't take these things lightly. Do a good job on them. You can restore them. You can restore one of these so that it performs like the day it was bought. True, it's not a good timekeeper by today's standards. You know, the quartz movement has put everything else to shame. But it's still a valuable clock. And the people that have them want them repaired. They want them repaired good, and they're willing to pay for them. So don't take this class of work lightly. Not at all. All right, I'll lay this back into the case, not lay it into the case. I'll assemble it into the case and set it running. We'll probably take a last-minute look at it with the camera when we place it in operation in the case. But let me assess how much time we have on this tape. Looks like the tape has 20-30 minutes remaining time on it. I didn't start the footage counter on the recorder when I started this tape, but just from judging on the spool, it has about that much. I'll assemble this back into the case. We'll take a look on that, and we'll finish the tape off with another subject matter. Thank you for being with me. My name is J.M. Huckabee. I reside in the hill country near Lake Travis, just north of Austin, Texas. We live on a piece of rural property called the J.B. Ranch, and I'm retired, preparing these tapes to help other workmen in the trade. Good to be with you. Here's what the clock movement looks like that we've been working on this tape. It back in the case and running well. I mentioned a little earlier that the escapement was working out good, with showing good strength and motion with the mainspring almost down, and that when I restored it to the case, or returned it to the case, that I would check to see how many turns of the mainspring was required to wind it up. And indeed I did when I placed this back in the case. I found that it required 9 1/4 turns to wind that mainspring. Now, based on the findings of approximately 1 turn per 24 hours, that movement could run, the time side of it could run more than 9 days from a full wind. And that's the type of thing that you get from a movement when the pivots are all placed in good order. I'm persuaded that most mainsprings that are replaced, that are not literally broken, that is, replaced for being weak, are really replaced because if there are other problems in the movement. And again, what period of test run will be required on this? Well, as soon as I can determine that its rate, that is, its regulation, is adequate, then the test run will be over. So that's the way the situation is in dealing with pivot work. I was pleased to lay hands onto this clock at this time because the tape that I made a week or so ago in dealing with pivot problems and philosophies and repair techniques and whatnot, we've been able to demonstrate on this tape today. Now, in the normal repair of a clock of this type, you would find that, or I find that I can go through that type of pivot work extremely fast. Extremely fast. The tools that I have are the best that money can buy. They're convenient to use. I am thoroughly familiar with them. I have done this so much that it is very, very easy type of work for me to handle. And by no means do I recommend that every clock that you lay your hands on that you go through that extensive pivot work. But do assess the situation. If you have ringing on the pivot, if you have ringing on both ends of one of the pivots, there is a very, very good possibility that it will give you latent trouble in intermittently stopping. So that's the way it is in fighting the pivots right down to the finest art. I want to touch another little subject matter before we go away from this movement. I mentioned that I cut the not the mainspring, I cut the suspension spring from a commercial suspension spring, that I cut it off and formed it and placed it into this movement. One of the great problems that we have in dealing with suspension springs is the hole in it, or the dimple in it, to hang it in the its hanger, is how to get that hole in it, or how to get the dimple in the spring. I want to set this clock aside and pull the camera up to a closer view, and I'll take this old suspension spring that I removed. I'll show you how to cut it, how to pierce a hole in it, how to place a dimple on it, whatnot. This is some of the little things that's in the trade that younger workmen generally don't know. Yet to the old-timer, it's one of the simplest steps that there is in a day's repair. So we'll pause. I'll clean the bench up, and get ready to show you how to handle that suspension spring situation. I made the statement that we would see how to form the dimple, how to cut a suspension spring and how to form the dimple. This is something that's pretty poorly made that was removed from a clock, so I'll just use this as a cut sample here. Just a good old pair of seamstress shears. Let me measure the length of these. The cut on these is 3.5 inches long, so they're not all that big. Remember, I'm in a size of my hand here. I'm in a very close-up camera situation. That pair of seamstress scissors will cut that suspension spring material just like that. That's all there is to it. If you need to narrow a piece of it, like that. And I've removed a piece so small that I can hardly pick it up. There's the piece that I've trimmed off. So that's how easy suspension spring material is to cut with just a good pair of strong scissors. Now, the question is, how do we cut a hole in it if we want to make up our own suspension rod? And how do we put the dimple in it to hang it in the chops? I have a variety of tools around here that will do that, but one of the simplest is a watchmaker's staking tool and punch. This punch has a tiny little ball face on it, hemispheric face. That you choose that for about the size of the dimple you want. And choose a hole in the die plate that you can pass through very readily, that you can go down into that die plate a little way. This is a little scrap of brass. If you like, you can use aluminum. They work equally well. And we'll lay that on the die plate, and to ease the problem of holding this, let's take a piece of masking tape and we'll just tape that to the die plate like that. Now, we take the hammer, use a brass faced hammer on your staking set. This is an inverto model where that you can upend the punches and you don't want to mushroom the head, so always use a brass faced hammer. And we drive into this a dimple as deep as we want to raise up the dimple on the suspension spring. The tape holds this in position. We would slip the suspension spring in at whatever place that we like. I'm holding down on the punch so this doesn't get away, and we can take a look at it there like that, and just tap the hammer about that much, and let's take a look. Here is the hole, and that's just how easy that is to do. That knocked that hole right in that spring, and if we use a flat face punch, we can knock it in there just as easy. If I had not gone as deep, I would have a dimple. Let's go in here. Be sure I picked up the proper punch. Let's go in here and place a dimple in it now. And take a look right here. You see, we have the dimple. If we don't like that, we just snip off and come back and do this again. There you are, and that's all there is to it. Very, very easy to do, yet that's a trick that most people don't know that can be done. Use a piece of brass or piece of aluminum, something that you can form see, we formed a dimple in this plate. Here's where I use that at other times. But that's the way to take care of those problems that, well, if you just try to imagine how to cut a hole in that hardened steel spring, it just spoils your day. But you can do it so easy with the staking set. All right, let's discuss one more little kind of item of humor. A little while ago I was relating the story in the children's book when I was a lad, that where the lady says to her wealthy son, when he says, 3 wishes, anything you want, Mama, and she says, I'll take a new pipe. And then she says, I'll take all the tobacco I can smoke. And he says, all right, what's your 3rd wish? And after considerable thought, she says, well, I think I'll just take a little more tobacco. And that's the way the bench block situation is that I started out to tell. The bench blocks, here's one with a large staking stump in it, another of another type. We look at another with many holes and stumps and whatnot in it, and still another, and another, and this goes on and on and on, and still another, and more and more, and parallel bars and so forth. So I suppose that if you wanted to make old Huckabee happy, just put another bench block in his hand. Once you've experienced all the good things in life, there's not much left except to desire one more bench block. So much for the humor. Thank you for being with me today. I'm J.M. Huckabee. I reside on the J.B. Ranch on the north outskirts of Austin, Texas. This is September the 23rd, 1988. I'm retired, making these tapes to help the younger workmen. Thank you for being with me. Another item I'm going to talk about here. What do you find in clocks? That clock I was just working on had this little wattle in it. Of course, it has to go with the clock. That little bottle, you may or may not know what it is. I suppose it was a little perfume bottle or something of the distant past. But as a small child in the Southland, all of the old folks kept a little bottle about like this, a little pill bottle or something sitting in their clock, filled with kerosene. And the story is that lubricates the clock, makes them run a long time, and sure enough they did. Now, whether the bottle and the kerosene had any contributory advantage or not, I don't know. But a bottle that I found, and not in a clock, that I think is one of the most unusual ones that I've encountered in many years. This says Thomas A. Edison, and the T has something over the top. That was Thomas Edison's signature many years ago. It says registered U.S. mark, patent office, made in USA. It says trade here. I think what that's supposed to be read is trademark, Thomas A. Edison, registered U.S. patent office, made in USA. Has the cork stopper pushed to the inside of it. Now the unusual thing on this bottle, and this just tears your mind up, and I told the story of oil in the clock with a bottle of kerosene as a preface to this. This bottle says special battery oil, Thomas A. Edison Incorporated, Primary Battery Division, Bloomington, New Jersey, USA. Now who knows what battery oil is? What is battery oil? What is clock oil? How do you oil a battery? What's the purpose of oiling a battery? Well, I'm old enough And in the little town that I grew up in, there was 5 railroads that come into that little town. It was kind of a crossroads in the Southland. And my grandmother lived 2 or 3 blocks from the railroad station. So as a lad of about 8 or 10 or 12 years old, I'd go visit my grandma, and the first thing I'd do is go over to the railroad station and watch trains come in. Well, if there was no trains arriving, I'd drive the telegraph operator crazy. He was the telegraph operator, station agent, ticket agent, and all of those things, and after so long a time he would run me off, and so I'd go drive the baggage agent crazy. But in that telegraph office there were about 10 jars. These were round jars about 1 foot in diameter and about 2 feet high, and they were stacked on a rack in that telegraph office, and each one of these jars had a large copper crowfoot in the bottom of the jar and a large zinc crowfoot in the top of the jar, and they hung on the edge of the jar. I may have this backwards. The zinc may have been in the bottom, the copper in the top, but that's what the situation was. And there was a saturated solution of copper sulfate in those jars. It was called bluestone, and that bluestone was very pretty and purple. And those were the batteries to operate the telegraph apparatus. And I have seen the station agent take a bottle of oil, and this bottle was the size that you poured 1 bottle of oil on top of the water in each of those batteries each time that they were washed out and replenished with a new chemical. And the purpose of that oil was to stop the evaporation of the water. It sealed the surface and stopped the evaporation of the water from the telegraph batteries. So this bottle, which I found in recent years, brings back the memories of that. But I wonder if somewhere in the clockmaker's experience, if someone has ever found a bottle that says on that bottle, clock oil. It would be interesting to know if some hawker really marketed a little bottle that was literally labeled clock oil to be placed inside the case of a clock to lubricate it with its aromatic fumes. It's an interesting thought that I've run through my mind over many years. All right, so thank you again for being with me.